ever wondered what happens when religious devotion turns deadly, when faith becomes a weapon and isolation breeds extremism? Deep in the hollers and ridges of Appalachia, where the outside world feels like a distant memory, some communities have twisted sacred beliefs into something horrifying. Today, we're descending into the shadowy world of Appalachian cults that made national headlines for all the wrong reasons. So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time it is for you. These aren't your typical religious communities. We're talking about groups that practiced ritualistic abuse, financial exploitation, and in some cases, orchestrated mass deaths that shocked even seasoned investigators. Law enforcement officers who worked these cases still describe them as the most disturbing they've ever encountered. What makes these cults particularly chilling is how they used the natural isolation of Appalachian terrain to hide their activities for decades. The mountains have always attracted those seeking to escape mainstream society, but for some, that escape became a descent into madness that would claim dozens of lives and leave survivors scarred for generations. From snake-handling congregations that took biblical literalism to fatal extremes, to apocalyptic communes that prepared for the end times through violence and depravity, these groups represent some of the darkest chapters in American religious history. 1. The Covenant of the Sacred Serpent. Nestled in a remote valley of eastern Kentucky, this group emerged in the 1960s under the leadership of a charismatic preacher named Jeremiah Kane. What started as a traditional Pentecostal congregation practicing serpent handling quickly evolved into something far more sinister. Kane claimed to receive direct revelations from God, instructing his followers to embrace increasingly dangerous practices as tests of their faith. The compound they established covered nearly 200 acres of rugged mountain terrain, completely cut off from the nearest town by miles of winding dirt roads. Members were required to surrender all personal possessions and sever ties with outside family. Children born into the community never attended public school, never saw doctors, and were taught that the outside world was controlled by Satan himself. What made this group particularly dangerous was their interpretation of biblical passages about handling deadly serpents. While traditional snake-handling churches typically used 1 or 2 venomous snakes during services, the Covenant kept dozens of the most lethal species found in North America. Timber rattlesnakes, copperheads, and even imported coral snakes were housed in crude wooden boxes throughout their meeting hall. But the serpents were just the beginning. Kane introduced increasingly bizarre rituals, claiming each one was divinely inspired. Members were required to drink strychnine mixed with water, walk barefoot across beds of burning coals, and engage in ritualistic scarification where they carved biblical verses into their own flesh. Those who refused were branded as lacking faith and subjected to public humiliation and isolation. The breaking point came during what Kane called the Great Purification. In 1975, he announced that God had commanded the entire congregation to prove their worthiness through a mass serpent-handling ceremony. Unlike previous rituals, where only adults participated, this time children as young as 5 were required to handle the deadly snakes. When several members expressed concern, Kane declared them apostates and ordered their immediate banishment from the community. The ceremony took place on a sweltering August evening. Nearly 80 people gathered in the meeting hall, with wooden crates containing over 30 venomous serpents arranged at the front. What happened next was captured in disturbing detail by several survivors who later testified to authorities. As the ritual began, multiple people were bitten almost immediately. Instead of seeking medical attention, Cain proclaimed that those who were bitten simply lacked sufficient faith. Over the course of 3 hours, 14 people died from snake bites, including 6 children. The youngest victim was 7-year-old Mary Beth Collins, whose parents watched helplessly as she succumbed to the venom while Cain continued preaching about divine judgment. Those who survived the initial bites were forbidden from seeking medical treatment, and 3 more died over the following days. The tragedy only came to light when 2 teenage members managed to escape and reached authorities. When state police and federal agents finally raided the compound, they found a horrific scene. Bodies were stacked in a storage building, wrapped in crude shrouds, while the surviving members continued their daily routines as if nothing had happened. Cain himself was found in his private quarters, apparently having consumed a lethal dose of strychnine rather than face arrest. The investigation revealed the full extent of the group's depravity. Medical examiners discovered evidence of systematic child abuse, malnutrition, and untreated medical conditions among both the living and the dead. Financial records showed that Cain had been stealing government benefit checks from elderly members while forcing them to live in squalid conditions. Perhaps most disturbing were the journals kept by several members, documenting years of escalating abuse justified through twisted biblical interpretation. One entry, written by a mother who lost 2 children in the final ceremony, described how she had been conditioned to view her children's deaths as a blessing that would guarantee their salvation. The compound was eventually demolished, but locals still avoid the area. Hikers report finding remnants of the snake pens and ritual spaces scattered throughout the woods. Some claim to hear faint sounds of hymn singing carried on the wind during certain weather conditions, though skeptics attribute this to natural acoustic phenomena in the mountain terrain. 2. The Mountain of Zion Fellowship. Hidden in the rugged hills of West Virginia, this apocalyptic cult operated from 1978 to 1993 under the iron rule of a former coal miner turned prophet named Ezekiel Morrison. What distinguished this group from other religious communes was their elaborate preparation for what Morrison called the Final Tribulation, a period of global catastrophe that would precede the second coming of Christ. Morrison attracted followers by preaching a unique blend of fundamentalist Christianity and survivalist ideology. He claimed to have received visions showing him exactly when and how the world would end, and convinced his disciples that only those who followed his specific instructions would survive the coming apocalypse. The group's compound, carved into a mountainside using mining equipment Morrison had acquired through dubious means, resembled a military installation more than a religious community. The complex featured underground bunkers stocked with weapons, ammunition, and enough food to sustain 200 people for several years. Morrison demanded that all members undergo military-style training, claiming they would need to defend themselves against government forces and demon-possessed masses during the end times. Children as young as 10 were taught to handle firearms and explosives, with those showing reluctance subjected to brutal punishment sessions Morrison called spiritual correction. Financial control was absolute. Members were required to turn over all assets, including property, vehicles, and bank accounts. Morrison used these resources to purchase increasingly sophisticated weapons and surveillance equipment, transforming the compound into what federal investigators later described as one of the most heavily fortified private installations they had ever encountered. The group's isolation was maintained through a combination of geographic remoteness and psychological manipulation. Morrison taught that any contact with outsiders would contaminate members spiritually and potentially trigger premature apocalyptic events. Families were systematically broken apart, with spouses and children assigned to different living quarters and work details to prevent the formation of loyalty bonds that might compete with devotion to Morrison. As the 1980s progressed, Morrison's prophecies became increasingly specific and violent. He claimed that the tribulation would begin with a series of natural disasters, followed by foreign invasion and government persecution of true believers. Members were told they would be called upon to serve as God's army, purging the earth of unbelievers through divinely sanctioned violence. The group's first known criminal activity occurred in 1985, when several members robbed a series of banks across 3 states to fund weapon purchases. Morrison justified these crimes as righteous seizure of resources from a corrupt system, and members who expressed moral concerns were subjected to prolonged isolation and forced labor as punishment for their spiritual weakness. By 1990, the compound housed nearly 300 people, including dozens of children born into the community. Former members who escaped during this period described a society ruled by fear and arbitrary violence. Morrison had established a complex hierarchy among his followers, with higher-ranking members given authority to punish those beneath them for infractions ranging from questioning doctrine to showing insufficient enthusiasm during worship services. The breaking point came when Morrison announced that God had revealed the exact date of the apocalypse, March 15, 1993. He declared that faithful members would be transformed into immortal warriors on that date, while the rest of humanity would face divine judgment. As the appointed day approached, Morrison's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. 3 weeks before the predicted apocalypse, Morrison ordered the execution of 12 members he claimed had been revealed to him as secret government infiltrators. These individuals, including 2 families with young children, were shot during what Morrison called a purification ceremony. Their bodies were buried in a mass grave on the compound grounds, while the remaining members were forced to watch as a warning against disloyalty. When March 15th arrived without any supernatural events, Morrison claimed that God had tested the group's faith and found them wanting. He announced that the apocalypse had been postponed, but that divine judgment would soon fall upon the community itself unless they demonstrated greater commitment through a final act of devotion. That final act, as investigators later determined, was planned as a mass murder-suicide that would have claimed nearly 300 lives. Morrison had stockpiled enough cyanide to poison the entire community and was preparing to administer it during what he called the Ascension Ceremony. The plan was discovered when a teenage member found the poison cache and managed to alert authorities before the ceremony could take place. The FBI raid that followed lasted 3 days and required the deployment of specialized tactical units due to the compound's extensive fortifications. Morrison was killed in the initial assault, apparently by his own hand, while dozens of his followers barricaded themselves in the underground bunkers. The siege ended when negotiators convinced the remaining members that Morrison's death proved his prophecies were false. The investigation revealed the full scope of the group's criminal activities and internal violence. In addition to the 12 execution victims, investigators discovered evidence of at least 30 other suspicious deaths over the community's 15-year existence. Many members showed signs of severe malnutrition and untreated medical conditions, while children displayed symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological trauma. Financial records indicated that Morrison had amassed a personal fortune of over $2 million through member contributions and criminal activities, money he had hidden in overseas accounts while forcing his followers to live in primitive conditions. The weapons cache discovered at the compound included military-grade explosives, automatic weapons, and chemical agents that could have caused mass casualties if deployed as Morrison had apparently planned. The compound was eventually destroyed by controlled demolition, but the psychological scars left on survivors proved more difficult to eliminate. Many former members required years of therapy to overcome the conditioning they had experienced, while others never fully recovered from the trauma of watching family members executed for alleged disloyalty. 3. The Eternal Light Ministry. Operating from 1985 to 1998 in the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee, this group represented one of the most psychologically sophisticated and financially successful cults in Appalachian history. Under the leadership of a former psychology professor named Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the ministry attracted well-educated professionals seeking spiritual fulfillment, only to trap them in a web of manipulation and exploitation that would ultimately claim dozens of lives. Whitmore's background in behavioral psychology gave him unique insights into human vulnerability and manipulation techniques. Unlike the crude coercion employed by other cult leaders, Whitmore developed elaborate psychological profiles of potential recruits and tailored his approach to exploit their specific emotional needs and weaknesses. His methods were so effective that many victims never realized they were being manipulated until years after their escape. The ministry's compound, disguised as a therapeutic retreat center, was strategically located on 400 acres of pristine mountain wilderness. Whitmore marketed it as an alternative healing facility that combined traditional therapy with spiritual enlightenment, attracting successful doctors, lawyers, business executives, and academics who were experiencing midlife crises or personal traumas. The sophisticated marketing materials and professional website gave no indication of the horrors that awaited those who committed to extended stays. What made Whitmore particularly dangerous was his ability to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities with clinical precision. During initial consultation sessions, he would conduct extensive interviews that appeared to be standard therapeutic intake procedures. In reality, he was mapping each person's deepest fears, unresolved traumas, and emotional dependencies to create customized manipulation strategies. The indoctrination process began subtly. New arrivals were assigned personal mentors from among the long-term residents, individuals who had been so thoroughly conditioned that they genuinely believed they were helping newcomers achieve spiritual breakthrough. These mentors would share carefully crafted testimonials about their own transformations, creating powerful social proof that Whitmore's methods were not only legitimate, but life-changing. Whitmore implemented what he called progressive disclosure therapy, where participants gradually revealed increasingly intimate details about their lives, relationships, and finances during group sessions. These confessions were recorded under the guise of therapeutic documentation, but Whitmore used the information to identify blackmail material and assess each person's financial worth. The physical isolation of the compound was reinforced through psychological techniques designed to sever emotional connections to the outside world. Whitmore taught that family members and friends who questioned a participant's involvement were actually agents of negative spiritual forces trying to prevent their enlightenment. He provided detailed explanations for why loved ones might seem concerned, framing their worry as jealousy or spiritual blindness. Communication with the outside world was gradually restricted through a series of seemingly reasonable policies. Participants were told that constant external contact would interfere with their therapeutic progress, and that truly committed individuals would voluntarily limit such distractions. Phone calls were monitored under the pretense of providing therapeutic feedback, while letters were reviewed to ensure they maintained appropriate spiritual perspectives. Financial exploitation began with voluntary donations that escalated into complete asset surrender. Whitmore convinced participants that material possessions were spiritual barriers preventing their full transformation. He provided compelling psychological explanations for why attachment to wealth and property created emotional blockages, and presented asset surrender as a therapeutic breakthrough rather than exploitation. The ministry's daily routine was designed to maximize psychological control while maintaining the appearance of voluntary participation. Days began at 5 in the morning with meditation sessions that incorporated subtle hypnotic techniques. Meals were communal affairs, where Whitmore delivered lengthy lectures on spiritual principles, using sophisticated persuasion methods to reinforce his authority and the group's belief system. Work assignments were framed as spiritual practices that would accelerate personal growth. Participants found themselves laboring in the ministry's organic gardens, construction projects, and various business enterprises that generated substantial revenue. The physical exhaustion, combined with restricted sleep and inadequate nutrition, created optimal conditions for psychological manipulation. Whitmore's most insidious innovation was his use of therapeutic terminology to justify increasingly abusive practices. Punishment for questioning his authority was reframed as intensive therapy sessions designed to break through psychological resistance. Physical deprivation was described as detoxification that would purify both body and spirit. Isolation from other participants was presented as individual reflection time necessary for spiritual breakthrough. The hierarchy within the ministry was complex and deliberately confusing. Whitmore appointed various levels of counselors and spiritual advisors from among long-term residents, creating competition and surveillance among the participants themselves. Those who demonstrated absolute loyalty were rewarded with positions of minor authority, while those who showed any signs of independent thinking were subjected to intensive correction procedures. Sexual exploitation was systematically implemented through what Whitmore called sacred union therapy. He convinced participants that traditional concepts of monogamy and sexual boundaries were psychological limitations that prevented spiritual evolution. Women were told that intimate relationships with Whitmore represented the highest form of spiritual communion, while men were conditioned to view such arrangements as evidence of their own spiritual inadequacy that required further therapeutic work. Children born into the community or brought by adult participants were subjected to educational programs designed to ensure absolute compliance. Whitmore claimed that traditional schooling corrupted young minds with materialistic values, and instead implemented a curriculum focused entirely on ministry doctrine and unquestioning obedience to authority figures. The ministry's financial operations were sophisticated enough to avoid detection by tax authorities for over a decade. Whitmore established multiple nonprofit organizations and business entities that created the appearance of legitimate therapeutic and educational activities. Participant assets were transferred through complex legal arrangements that made recovery nearly impossible even after their eventual escape. By the mid-1990s, the ministry controlled assets worth over $15 million while housing nearly 200 full-time residents. Whitmore had expanded operations to include satellite facilities in 3 other states, each operating under different organizational names but following identical manipulation protocols. Former participants who attempted to expose the group found themselves facing sophisticated legal challenges funded by their own surrendered assets. The first cracks in Whitmore's empire appeared when several participants died under suspicious circumstances during intensive therapy sessions. Official death certificates listed natural causes, but a former resident who had worked as a nurse documented evidence suggesting these deaths resulted from deliberate medical neglect or induced psychological trauma that triggered fatal medical episodes. The breakthrough came when Dr. Jennifer Morrison, a psychiatrist who had spent 3 years in the ministry, managed to escape with detailed documentation of Whitmore's methods and financial crimes. Her professional credentials gave weight to accusations that might otherwise have been dismissed as the complaints of disgruntled former members. She had secretly recorded therapy sessions and photographed financial documents that revealed the full scope of the ministry's exploitation. Morrison's evidence triggered a multi-agency investigation involving the FBI, IRS, and state medical licensing boards. The complexity of Whitmore's psychological manipulation techniques required investigators to consult with experts in cult psychology and financial fraud to understand the full scope of his crimes. When federal agents finally raided the compound in 1998, they discovered a facility that resembled a psychiatric hospital more than a religious community. Hidden surveillance equipment monitored residents' private conversations, while Whitmore's personal quarters contained detailed psychological profiles and manipulation strategies for each participant. Medical records showed evidence of systematic drugging designed to increase suggestibility and reduce resistance to authority. The raid itself was complicated by the fact that many residents genuinely believed they were being rescued from a beneficial therapeutic program by misguided government agents. Some participants that actively resisted the investigation, convinced that outside interference would prevent their spiritual transformation. It took months of deprogramming work by cult recovery specialists to help many survivors understand the extent of their exploitation. Whitmore was found dead in his private office, apparently having consumed a lethal combination of medications from the facility's medical supplies. His suicide note claimed that government persecution had forced him to abandon his divine mission to heal humanity's psychological wounds. Even in death, he continued manipulating his followers by framing his destruction as martyrdom rather than justice. The investigation revealed that at least 18 people had died at the ministry over its 13-year existence, with causes ranging from medical neglect to suicide induced by psychological torture disguised as therapy. Financial analysis showed that Whitmore had stolen over $12 million from participants while forcing them to live in conditions that barely met basic health standards. Recovery efforts for survivors proved extraordinarily challenging due to the sophisticated nature of their psychological conditioning. Many required years of specialized therapy to overcome the trauma and regain the ability to make independent decisions. Some never fully recovered their capacity for trust or intimate relationships, while others struggled with persistent guilt over their participation in recruiting and manipulating fellow victims. The ministry's facilities were eventually sold to satisfy legal judgments against Whitmore's estate, though most participants recovered only a fraction of their surrendered assets. The remote mountain location was purchased by a legitimate retreat center that spent considerable resources, removing the surveillance equipment and psychological manipulation infrastructure that Whitmore had installed throughout the buildings. The legal battles surrounding survivor compensation continued for nearly a decade, with Whitmore's estate tied up in complex litigation involving multiple jurisdictions. Many former participants found themselves fighting not only for financial recovery, but for their professional reputations, as Whitmore had deliberately targeted individuals whose careers could be destroyed by association with cult activities. 4. The Blood Covenant Brotherhood. Deep in the coal country of southwestern Virginia, this group operated from 1972 to 1987 under the leadership of twin brothers Marcus and Matthew Crane. What set this cult apart from others was their unique blend of fundamentalist Christianity with occult practices they claimed were revealed through divine visions. The brothers convinced their followers that traditional Christianity had been corrupted by modern society, and that only through blood sacrifice and ritualistic purification could true believers achieve salvation. The Crane brothers established their compound in an abandoned mining town that had been deserted since the 1950s. The isolation was nearly complete, with the nearest populated area over 40 miles away through treacherous mountain roads that became impassable during winter months. This geographic barrier proved crucial to maintaining control over their growing congregation of desperate souls seeking spiritual meaning in the economically devastated region. Marcus, the more charismatic of the twins, served as the group's primary prophet and theological interpreter. He claimed to receive nightly visions from an angel he called Azrael, who provided specific instructions for rituals and lifestyle requirements. Matthew handled the practical aspects of compound management and disciplinary actions, creating a dual leadership structure that prevented any single challenger from threatening their authority. The Brotherhood's daily routines revolved around elaborate ceremonies that combined Christian symbolism with practices borrowed from various occult traditions. Members participated in dawn rituals involving the consumption of animal blood mixed with wine, claiming this communion would gradually transform their physical bodies to withstand the trials of the approaching end times. Those who showed reluctance or became ill during these ceremonies were told their faith remained insufficient and required intensive spiritual counseling. Recruitment focused heavily on families experiencing economic hardship or personal tragedy. The Crane brothers positioned themselves as healers and prophets who could provide both spiritual salvation and practical solutions to life's problems. They targeted unemployed coal miners, widowed mothers, and elderly individuals whose Social Security benefits made them particularly valuable additions to the community's financial resources. New members underwent a 3-month initiation period called the purification process, during which they were gradually separated from outside influences and indoctrinated into the Brotherhood's belief system. The process began with seemingly reasonable requirements like daily prayer and Bible study, but escalated to include fasting periods, sleep deprivation, and isolation from other family members within the compound. The financial structure was designed to maximize exploitation while maintaining the appearance of voluntary religious devotion. Members were told that material possessions represented spiritual contamination that prevented divine blessing. Asset surrender was framed as an act of faith that would unlock supernatural provision for all their needs. The Crane brothers claimed that God would multiply the community's resources as long as everyone contributed according to their ability. Housing arrangements deliberately broke down family structures and created dependencies on the leadership for basic needs. Married couples were assigned to separate dormitories, with conjugal visits requiring permission from the brothers. Children were housed in communal nurseries where they received religious education designed to ensure loyalty to the Brotherhood rather than their biological parents. The group's interpretation of biblical prophecy focused heavily on themes of divine judgment and the necessity of violence to establish God's kingdom on earth. Members were taught that they had been chosen as instruments of divine wrath who would be called upon to execute judgment against unbelievers during the tribulation period. Military-style training sessions were conducted under the guise of preparing for spiritual warfare against demonic forces. As the 1980s progressed, the Crane brothers became increasingly paranoid about government infiltration and outside interference. They installed extensive security measures around the compound, including armed guards, surveillance cameras, and early warning systems designed to detect approaching vehicles. Members were assigned rotating watch duties and instructed to report any suspicious activity or conversations that might indicate disloyalty. The Brotherhood's criminal activities began with relatively minor infractions like tax evasion and welfare fraud, but escalated as the brothers' paranoia and grandiosity increased. They justified theft and extortion as righteous seizure of resources from a corrupt society, claiming that civil laws did not apply to those operating under divine authority. Members who expressed moral concerns were accused of spiritual weakness and subjected to intensive correction procedures. The group's most disturbing practices involved ritualistic punishment sessions they called cleansing ceremonies. Members accused of various infractions were subjected to physical abuse, psychological torture, and forced participation in increasingly bizarre rituals designed to demonstrate their submission to the brothers' authority. These sessions were presented as spiritual interventions necessary to prevent divine judgment from falling upon the entire community. Medical care was strictly controlled and often denied based on the brothers' claims of divine healing abilities. Several elderly members died from treatable conditions after being forbidden to seek outside medical attention. Children showing signs of illness were subjected to prayer sessions and ritual treatments that often worsened their conditions. The compound's isolation made it nearly impossible for anyone to seek help without the leadership's knowledge and permission. The breaking point came during the winter of 1986, when a severe blizzard trapped the entire community for nearly 3 weeks. Food supplies ran dangerously low, and several members began questioning the brothers' claims about divine provision. Instead of acknowledging the crisis, Marcus and Matthew declared that the hardship was a test of faith that required extreme measures to demonstrate the community's worthiness. They announced that God had revealed the need for a great sacrifice that would unlock supernatural provision and usher in the final phase of their divine mission. The sacrifice, they claimed, would require the willing death of the 12 most faithful members, whose blood would consecrate the compound and transform the remaining believers into immortal warriors for God's kingdom. The chosen victims included elderly members whose Social Security benefits had been particularly valuable to the community's finances, as well as several individuals who had recently expressed doubts about the brothers' leadership. The ceremony was scheduled for the winter solstice, with elaborate preparations that included the construction of an altar and the gathering of ritualistic implements. 3 days before the planned sacrifice, a teenage member named Sarah Hutchins managed to escape through a basement window during a blizzard. Despite nearly freezing to death during her trek through the mountains, she reached a highway and flagged down a snowplow operator who contacted authorities. Her account of the planned mass murder triggered an immediate law enforcement response despite the dangerous weather conditions. The rescue operation required coordination between state police, federal agents, and National Guard units equipped with winter survival gear. The compound's remote location and the ongoing blizzard made approach extremely difficult, but authorities recognized that any delay could result in multiple deaths. Helicopter support was impossible due to weather conditions, forcing rescue teams to traverse the mountain terrain on foot and snowmobiles. When law enforcement finally reached the compound, they found a community in the grip of religious hysteria. The planned sacrifice had been moved up due to fears about outside interference, and the first 3 victims had already been killed during preliminary rituals. The remaining chosen victims were bound and awaiting their turn, while other members participated in frenzied prayer sessions designed to invoke divine protection against the approaching authorities. The Crane brothers initially refused to surrender, claiming that government forces represented demonic opposition to God's plan. They threatened to kill the remaining intended victims rather than allow outside interference with their divine mission. The standoff lasted nearly 8 hours, complicated by the brothers' ability to manipulate their followers' fears about eternal damnation if they cooperated with secular authorities. The siege ended when Matthew Crane was killed by a police sniper after he began executing the bound victims in full view of law enforcement. Marcus attempted to detonate explosives that would have destroyed the main building with dozens of people inside, but was subdued before he could complete the detonation sequence. The improvised bomb, constructed from mining supplies stored at the compound, could have killed everyone in the immediate area. The investigation revealed the full scope of the Brotherhood's crimes and the psychological devastation inflicted on its members. In addition to the 3 murder victims, investigators discovered evidence of at least 8 other suspicious deaths over the group's 15-year existence. Many survivors showed signs of severe malnutrition, untreated medical conditions, and psychological trauma consistent with prolonged abuse. Financial records indicated that the Crane brothers had stolen over $800,000 from their followers while forcing them to live in conditions that barely met subsistence levels. The compound's buildings were found to be structurally unsound and lacking basic safety features, with heating systems that posed constant fire hazards and water supplies contaminated by improper waste disposal. Marcus Crane was eventually convicted on multiple charges, including murder, kidnapping, and financial fraud, receiving a life sentence without possibility of parole. During his trial, he continued claiming divine authority and predicting supernatural judgment against those who opposed him. Several survivors testified about the systematic abuse and manipulation they had experienced, though many required extensive psychological support to overcome their conditioning enough to provide coherent testimony. The compound was demolished after being declared uninhabitable by health and safety officials. Local authorities discovered that the brothers had been dumping human waste and chemical materials into nearby streams, creating environmental contamination that required expensive cleanup efforts. The site remained abandoned for years due to both practical concerns about contamination and local superstitions about the violence that had occurred there. Recovery efforts for survivors proved particularly challenging due to the isolated nature of their previous existence and the extent of their psychological conditioning. Many had spent years without contact with mainstream society and lacked basic skills for independent living. Government assistance programs helped with immediate needs like housing and medical care, but the emotional trauma required specialized intervention from cult recovery experts. Some former members never fully recovered from their experiences with the Brotherhood. Several committed suicide in the years following their rescue, unable to cope with the guilt and trauma associated with their participation in the group's activities. Others struggled with persistent paranoia and difficulty forming trusting relationships, while a few became advocates for cult awareness and prevention programs. The case attracted significant media attention and academic study due to the unique combination of Christian and occult elements in the Brotherhood's belief system. Researchers identified it as an example of how isolated communities could develop increasingly extreme practices when removed from mainstream social constraints and subjected to charismatic but unstable leadership. 5. The Divine Revelation Church. Operating from 1989 to 2001 in the mountains of North Carolina, this group represented one of the most financially sophisticated and psychologically manipulative cults in Appalachian history. Under the leadership of a former insurance executive named Patricia Devine, the church attracted middle-class families seeking spiritual fulfillment, only to subject them to a systematic program of exploitation that would ultimately destroy dozens of lives. Devine's background in actuarial science and risk assessment gave her unique insights into human psychology and financial vulnerability that she weaponized against her followers. Unlike other cult leaders who relied primarily on charisma or religious authority, Devine developed elaborate mathematical models for predicting and manipulating human behavior that made her manipulation techniques extraordinarily effective. The church's headquarters was established in a renovated resort facility that had been purchased through a complex web of shell corporations and fraudulent loans. Devine marketed the location as a spiritual retreat center that combined advanced therapeutic techniques with prophetic ministry, attracting successful professionals who were experiencing spiritual emptiness despite material success. Devine's recruitment strategy focused on individuals experiencing major life transitions like divorce, career changes, or health crises. She positioned herself as both a spiritual advisor and life coach who could provide divine guidance for navigating difficult decisions. Initial consultations appeared to be standard counseling sessions, but Devine was actually conducting detailed psychological assessments to identify each person's specific vulnerabilities and financial assets. The indoctrination process was gradual and scientifically precise. Devine had developed what she called the spiritual actuarial method, which used statistical analysis to predict how quickly different personality types would surrender their independence and resources. She tailored her approach to each individual's psychological profile, creating customized manipulation strategies that were nearly impossible to resist. New members were assigned to small groups led by carefully selected long-term residents who had been trained in Devine's manipulation techniques. These group leaders appeared to be fellow seekers sharing their spiritual journey, but they were actually conducting ongoing psychological assessments and reporting detailed observations about each new member's progress through the indoctrination process. Devine taught that traditional Christianity had been corrupted by denominational thinking, and that true spiritual revelation could only be received through her unique prophetic gift. She claimed to receive direct communications from God that provided specific guidance for individual members' lives, including career decisions, family relationships, and financial choices. These prophecies were actually based on detailed surveillance and psychological profiling that made them appear supernaturally accurate. The church's financial system was designed to maximize asset extraction while maintaining the appearance of voluntary religious giving. Devine convinced members that their material prosperity was directly linked to their level of financial commitment to the church's mission. She provided detailed biblical justifications for increasing contribution levels, claiming that God would multiply their investments through supernatural blessing. Members were required to submit detailed financial statements that Divine claimed were necessary for providing accurate prophetic guidance about their economic futures. These documents allowed her to identify all assets and develop strategies for acquiring them through donations, loans, or investment schemes that inevitably benefited only the church's leadership. Housing arrangements within the compound were designed to break down family loyalties and create dependencies on Divine's authority. Married couples were assigned to separate residential units with their children housed in communal facilities supervised by church-appointed caregivers. This separation was justified as necessary for intensive spiritual development that required freedom from family distractions. Divine established an elaborate hierarchy within the church that created competition and surveillance among the members themselves. Those who demonstrated absolute loyalty were rewarded with positions of minor authority and access to special teachings, while those showing any signs of independent thinking were subjected to intensive spiritual counseling designed to identify and eliminate sources of resistance. The church's educational system for children was designed to ensure complete psychological dependence on Divine's authority. Traditional academic subjects were integrated with church doctrine in ways that made it impossible to question religious teachings without rejecting basic knowledge. Children were taught that their biological parents were spiritually immature and that Divine represented their true spiritual mother who understood their eternal destiny. Sexual relationships within the church were strictly controlled through Divine's claims of prophetic insight into God's will for individual marriages and family structures. She convinced members that traditional concepts of monogamy and sexual boundaries were cultural limitations that prevented spiritual evolution. Women were told that intimate relationships with male church leaders represented advanced spiritual practices that would accelerate their personal development. As the church grew in size and wealth throughout the 1990s, Divine's prophecies became increasingly grandiose and specific. She claimed that God had revealed her as the final prophet who would prepare humanity for the second coming of Christ. Members were told they had been chosen to establish God's kingdom on earth through a combination of spiritual warfare and strategic financial investments guided by divine revelation. The church's business operations became increasingly complex and legally questionable as Divine used member assets to fund various investment schemes that promised supernatural returns. She claimed that God had revealed specific stock picks, real estate opportunities, and business ventures that would multiply the church's resources and demonstrate divine blessing to the outside world. By 1999, the church controlled assets worth over $20 million while housing nearly 400 full-time residents across multiple facilities. Divine had established satellite churches in 6 states, each operating under different corporate structures, but following identical manipulation protocols. The complexity of these financial arrangements made it nearly impossible for members to understand where their contributed assets had actually gone. The first signs of trouble appeared when several of Divine's predicted business opportunities resulted in massive losses that threatened the church's financial stability. Instead of acknowledging these failures, Divine claimed that Satan was attacking the church's prosperity through spiritual warfare that required even greater faith and financial commitment from members. When former members began questioning the church's financial practices and Divine's prophetic accuracy, she responded by implementing increasingly strict security measures and surveillance protocols. Members suspected of disloyalty were subjected to intensive interrogation sessions designed to identify sources of doubt and eliminate potential threats to church unity. The investigation that eventually brought down Divine's empire began when a former church accountant provided federal authorities with detailed financial records showing systematic fraud and money laundering operations. The complexity of the church's financial crimes required a multi-agency task force involving the FBI, IRS, and Securities and Exchange Commission to untangle the various schemes and identify all the victims. When federal agents raided the church's facilities in 2001, they discovered a sophisticated operation that combined religious manipulation with white-collar crime on an unprecedented scale. Hidden surveillance equipment monitored members' private conversations, while Divine's personal quarters contained detailed psychological profiles and financial assessments for hundreds of individuals. Divine was arrested while attempting to flee the country with over $2 million in cash and bearer bonds hidden in specially constructed luggage. Her suicide attempt in federal custody was unsuccessful, and she eventually stood trial on charges including fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The trial revealed the full scope of her manipulation techniques and the devastating impact on hundreds of victims who had surrendered their life savings to her schemes. The church's assets were eventually liquidated to provide partial compensation to victims, though most members recovered only a fraction of their contributed resources. The psychological damage proved even more difficult to address, as many former members struggled with shame and guilt over their participation in recruiting and manipulating fellow victims. Recovery programs established specifically for Divine's victims revealed the sophisticated nature of her psychological conditioning techniques. Many survivors required years of specialized therapy to overcome the trauma and regain the ability to make independent financial and personal decisions. Some never fully recovered their capacity for trust or spiritual faith, while others became advocates for cult awareness and financial fraud prevention. The case became a landmark study in the intersection of religious manipulation and financial crime, with law enforcement agencies developing new protocols for investigating similar schemes. Academic researchers identified Divine's methods as representing a new evolution in cult manipulation that combined traditional religious authority with sophisticated psychological and financial exploitation techniques. The remote mountain locations where these cults operated provided more than just physical isolation. They created psychological barriers that made escape seem impossible and outside help feel impossibly distant. Through the natural beauty of the Appalachian landscape became a prison that trapped hundreds of people in cycles of abuse and exploitation that lasted for decades. What makes these Appalachian cult stories particularly haunting is how they exploited the very qualities that make mountain communities special. The self-reliance, the tight-knit bonds, the deep spiritual traditions, all became weapons in the hands of manipulative leaders who understood that isolation breeds desperation, and desperation makes people vulnerable to promises of salvation. These weren't random acts of madness. Each group followed disturbingly similar patterns: charismatic leaders who claimed divine authority, gradual separation from outside support systems, financial exploitation disguised as religious devotion, and escalating violence justified through twisted theology. The mountain terrain that had once protected communities from outside threats became the perfect cover for predators who understood that help was always hours away. Perhaps most chilling is how these groups recruited their victims. They didn't target the weak or the foolish. They specifically sought out intelligent, successful people who were experiencing spiritual emptiness or life transitions. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, business owners, people who should have recognized manipulation, found themselves surrendering everything to leaders who promised answers to life's deepest questions. The survivors' accounts reveal the psychological sophistication of these operations. Leaders studied their victims with clinical precision, identifying specific fears and desires that could be weaponized. They understood that the most effective control comes not from physical force, but from convincing people that submission represents spiritual growth and that questioning authority indicates personal failure. The financial devastation these groups caused extends far beyond the immediate victims. Families were destroyed, children were traumatized, and entire communities were left scarred by the knowledge that such evil had flourished in their midst. The economic impact ran into tens of millions of dollars, representing the life savings of hundreds of people who trusted the wrong voices at vulnerable moments. Law enforcement officials who worked these cases consistently described them as among the most disturbing they've ever encountered. The combination of religious manipulation, psychological abuse, and systematic exploitation created crime scenes that challenged even experienced investigators. Many officers required counseling after witnessing the conditions in which victims had been forced to live. What's perhaps most troubling is how these groups managed to operate for years or even decades without detection. The isolation that made Appalachian communities strong also made them vulnerable to predators who understood how to exploit trust and tradition. Local law enforcement was often overwhelmed by the scope and sophistication of these operations, while federal agencies struggled to understand the cultural dynamics that allowed such groups to flourish. The legacy of these cults continues to impact Appalachian communities today. Survivors still struggle with the psychological damage inflicted by their experiences, while families continue fighting legal battles to recover assets stolen by manipulative leaders. The scars left on the landscape itself serve as reminders of how spiritual hunger can be twisted into something monstrous when placed in the wrong hands. So what drives people to surrender everything to charismatic leaders promising salvation? What makes intelligent, successful individuals abandon their families, their careers, their very identities for the chance at spiritual transformation? The answer lies in understanding that these weren't random victims. They were people searching for meaning in a world that often feels empty despite material success. The mountains have always attracted those seeking something beyond the ordinary. But as these stories demonstrate, the line between spiritual seeking and dangerous delusion can be frighteningly thin. In the isolated hollows where help is far away and outside voices rarely penetrate, the wrong kind of leader can create kingdoms of terror that destroy everything they touch. If you found yourself questioning how people could fall for such obvious manipulation, remember that none of these victims thought they were joining cults. They believed they were finding communities of faith, healing centers, or spiritual families that would help them become better people. That's what makes these stories so chilling and so important to remember. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because there are more dark corners of American history waiting to be explored. And remember, the most dangerous predators aren't the ones hiding in shadows. They're the ones standing in pulpits, promising salvation while planning destruction. Stay curious, but stay careful out there.